Moving to a new city from out of state is a very intimidating process. It can be scary. There's a lot of unknowns. There's a lot of considerations. And in this video, we're going to talk about what you need to know moving to Portland, Oregon, the metro area, and beyond in 2026. If you want to get the definitive list of what you need to know if you're making that move, stay tuned to learn more. Hey, what's up everybody? This is Paul Clem with the Oregon Relocation Team coming to you from Portland, Oregon. In this video, we're going to talk about some of the things you should really start thinking about when it comes to moving to Portland and the metro area specifically. Moving to a new city is, again, a very intimidating process, and there's a lot of things to think about and a lot of things that might not even be on the radar, let's say, because, there's so many things you're considering, logistics, dates, timing, the financial picture, and then there's also the cultural aspect of where you're moving to. How are you going to fit in? What is the weather going to be like? What are some of the lifestyle changes you might be making, either deliberately or will inevitably make just by nature of being in a new place? Portland is a very unique place. We've spent years, making videos, telling people what it's like living here. We've had a little bit of an uphill battle and some headwinds, doing that with Portland's reputation in the national media in particular. So we've spent a ton of time talking about crime and homelessness and even, some of the, political leanings of people that live here and what that's going to be like. I mean, you could be on one end of the spectrum politically, but obviously in Portland, at least by reputation, we've kind of taken it a lot further on a number of different issues. And there's both some truth to that and also, some aspects of that might be a little bit overblown, at least as it pertains or insofar as it would affect your day-to-day life. So those are some of the things that we're going to talk about and more. And if this is your first time to the channel or you've been here and you haven't already and you want to get more videos like this, make sure to hit the subscribe button, tap the little bell to get notified every time we drop a new video. We've helped so many people relocate to Portland, move to the Portland metro area. And as real estate professionals, we absolutely love to help with that process. So if you want to talk more about the topics in this video, if you want to talk more about different neighborhoods, suburbs of Portland, what it's like living here, what the process of buying a home in Oregon is like, you name it. We are here to help. Give us a call, send us a text, shoot us an email, or click the link down below in the description of the video. We can talk more about it. All right, so let's jump right into this. So you're moving to Portland, and it's like, okay, maybe you're moving here for a job. Maybe you're moving here to be closer to friends or family. Maybe you have some familiarity with the area, the layout, the different options, or maybe you don't. And every city, every metro area is going to present different opportunities and different options as far as the type and style of living that you can engage in, whether it be more in an urban setting, a suburban setting, and kind of anything in between, or on the outskirts of a metro area in maybe more of a rural setting, kind of a small town feel. I think you can get that at its most basic level or kind of those range of options anywhere. But Portland, I think for people moving here to the area, I think one thing that is really important to know, and something that we really try to instill in people in the early going when they're going through where they should be looking in their search and where they should think about moving to, is that you have options. You have a lot of options, and you have a big variety, a very diverse offering in terms of the types of areas that you could live in Portland. Portland specifically, like many major cities and metro areas, Portland, the city, is right in the middle, in the heart of the metro area. We have a river running right down that runs north-south, kind of right in the middle of the city. And Portland, rather the metro area, is really characterized by east and west. Now, you could be north and south too, but of course the river runs north-south. So a lot of people look at, and I think really, the actual experience of living here does play out where you're an East Sider or a West Sider. It's not like if you lived on the West Side, you couldn't get to the East Side or vice versa, and a lot of people do, and that's something we can talk more about. But if you live on the West Side, you're probably going to spend most of the time on the West Side. If you live on the East Side, you're going to spend most of your time on the East Side. Now, there are some southern sections of the metro area that gives you kind of more of a unique vantage point or unique levels of access to East and West. So if you were down in like West Lynn or Wilsonville or Tualatin, you're pretty close to major freeways, so you can get, up into the city on the West Side or the East Side. But on the west side of Portland, you have primarily Washington County and Washington County suburbs like Beaverton and Hillsborough, most notably, but also Tigard and Sherwood. Lake Oswego is also on the west side, but it's in Clackamas County. On the east side of the river, you have the majority of Multnomah County, which is where Portland proper is, and then you have Clackamas County on the east side as well, and Clackamas County suburbs, Milwaukee, Oregon City, Happy Valley, and again, Lake Oswego and West Lynn, for that matter, being on the west side of the river, are also in Clackamas County. So that's the only thing that doesn't quite fit in that puzzle. But the Portland metro area itself is really pretty sprawled. And again, you have kind of the urban center, and then you have more kind of urban adjacent, urban residential type areas that are within, let's say, 50, 60 blocks of the city on either side of the river, but in particular on the east side of the river. And then as you make your way out, into kind of the close-in suburbs and more the outer-lying suburbs, the construction, the age of homes, the age of the communities tends to get newer and newer as you build out. Oregon has a really strict urban growth boundaries, and Portland's urban growth boundary, doesn't expand very often. So when it does, all the new construction happens for the most part, the majority of it kind of, on the outermost lying areas of the metro area. So considering that, the type of home you would want to be in by default starts to dictate where you might land on a map. But if you said you wanted to be in a new neighborhood or an old neighborhood, for example, or even if you look at the topography, you can be in areas that are really hilly, and there are some cool things about that. You're often up in the trees, you can get views, things like that. That's really cool. Or if you wanted to be in an area that's more flat, there's options for that too. There's areas that are really well established. There's areas that are up and coming. You can kind of define that in a number of different ways. But I think, the good news is really across the spectrum of old and new and different topography and price ranges too. If you take kind of the top 3, 4, 5 variables, that you would be looking for, you can almost always make it fit. So there's truly something for everybody in Portland and in the metro area when it comes to types of neighborhoods and types of homes. The next big thing to consider if you're moving to Oregon, moving to Portland, is beware of the taxes. Oregon has the third highest tax burden in the country. I think we're behind New York and Hawaii. And so depending on where you live, depending on what your income is, depending on your tax situation, you could find some kind of better or worse situations. But yes, we don't have a sales tax. That's great. But we have a pretty high income tax. We have pretty high property taxes. And if you're living in Portland and in the metro area, most recently, the big consideration are the taxes for universal pre-K, which is in Multnomah County. And then the homelessness supportive services tax. It's a big acronym, but there's a new local income tax in Metro. So that's not just Multnomah County and Portland. That's also Washington County on the west side, Clackamas County on the east side. If you live anywhere in the metro area, in that Tri-County area, you are subject to the homelessness supportive services income tax. Obviously, there's a really big trade-off there, and it is up to you and the residents of Portland and the metro area to decide if that trade-off is worth it. You may have heard about people leaving the area, the population of Portland shrinking. There's certainly been truth to that over the last 5 years. It seems like that might be stabilizing a little bit, but among many other things, the high taxes is definitely something that is going to drive some percentage of people away. with the new income taxes locally for supporting the homeless population and universal pre-K. I think it's probably too early to look at those and really evaluate and measure improvements that have been made. I think it's really easy to look at these things and as people should, and really scrutinize each program and every dollar and what the metrics are and where the improvements are. And for the universal pre-K, which is a new program, okay, how many families is that serving? What type of public benefit is that actually having? Because in a pretty liberal, left-leaning city, state, part of the country, I think a lot of people, we voted this in. So, this is something that in theory, a lot of people obviously have gotten behind. But I think what we'll be looking for in the future, with these new taxes for the Portland metro area specifically, is what type of impact is this actually having? But still, none of that changes the fact that, we still have one of the highest state income taxes in the country as well. So I think for somebody moving here, depending on where you're coming from, depending on what your income looks like now, maybe you're coming here for a job specifically, maybe you got a 30% raise by taking a job here. And yes, you're paying more in taxes. You're going to have to look at that margin, and see if that still makes sense. But point being is that very likely, even if you're coming from California, your tax situation is going to be different, and very likely you could be paying more taxes living in Portland. All right, next is you should really start preparing for a lifestyle adjustment, whether that is for the good, for the worse. It's almost certainly going to be different living here in Portland than it is living where you're coming from. Whether it's culturally, whether it is what the area has to offer overall as far as things to do. Depending on where you're coming from, there could be more to do, or there could be far less to do. If you're coming from LA, San Francisco, even if you're coming from Seattle, which I think Portland and Seattle are pretty good comps. Portland is just a little bit smaller. There's going to be a little bit of a shock. Again, depending on what you like to do for fun and the types of things you like to engage in as far as entertainment. Now, if you're coming from a small town, if you're coming from even a smaller city, Portland very well may have a lot more to do and a lot more to offer. And a lot of it is kind of the cultural stuff too. I mean, what are the types of things that people, or rather the things that people are engaged in a place like LA, for example? You're not going to find a lot of that here in Portland. So I think a lot of people moving to the area understand that. They understand that there's going to be, again, culturally some differences and just different things to do overall as far as how you're going to fill your time. But I would say that kind of no matter what, Portland probably leans a little more on the boring side of things overall. Great restaurants, great places to go get drinks, and breweries and coffee shops. And there's little neighborhoods you can, go out and go shopping and, shop local stores and stuff like that. And that's all really cool. And I think there's probably more of that here than people realize, especially once you start to branch out a little bit and realize that, gosh, I mean, you could be on the east side of Portland and, within a 15-minute radius, just a couple mile radius, you could be in at least a half a dozen awesome little neighborhoods, these little pockets of the east side that have, so much to do and that are very true to the culture of Portland. And, if you want to get a crash course, spend an afternoon checking out Southeast Division, Southeast Hawthorne, Southeast Belmont, Northeast Alberta, North Mississippi, North Williams, Northeast 28th, go up to St. John's, go down to Selwood, Northwest 23rd, the Pearl District. I mean, again, you start adding this up and it's like, there's a fair amount to get out and do as far as entertainment goes, but it's just going to look and feel different. I think what we have going for us here for sure that, brings a lot of people to the area, or is just something that a lot of people are looking forward to, is all the opportunities to get outside and get outdoors, both locally and within, let's say, an hour to 2 hour drive of Portland. But you don't have to go far. There's going to be parks, there's going to be green spaces, there's going to be beautiful neighborhoods to get out and walk around in, all around the city and all around the Portland metro area too. There's, smaller neighborhood parks, there's big parks, with several dozen acres, 30, 40, 50 acre parks, wildlife refuge, green spaces, again, a ton to get out and do. So, if preparing for a lifestyle adjustment, if all that means is, okay, you're going to come here and spend more time outside, that might be revamping your wardrobe a little bit. You got to, maybe get the hiking boots ready and, hit the Columbia outlet and get your new Patagonia or whatever, and you'll be off to the races. Okay, next, you're going to want to get your yard signs ready. Just kidding. Kind of. Depends on where you live. But going around Portland proper in particular, different neighborhoods around Portland, Portland is a very politically active, very politically engaged. People are very politically motivated. I think people are very passionate. And obviously, that is, if we're looking at kind of Portland proper and Portland itself, maybe disregarding the metro area, the suburban areas a little bit, I mean, that is very much ingrained in the culture here. So you go around different neighborhoods in Portland and it's every other house has some kind of sign in front of their house. And I don't know, that might be a little bit intimidating for some people. I think on one hand, Portland's reputation precedes it as far as kind of what the zeitgeist is and what people believe. And, maybe everyone is, a crazy communist or Antifa or, whatever it is. And you certainly have, some contingent and some percentage of people, probably a larger percentage of people here in Portland, that have those types of beliefs that are more extreme on one end of the spectrum than you have in a lot of other areas around the country. I think it's a little more common for the West Coast, Northwest, Seattle in particular, but, other cities on the West Coast as well. I would say that if you were moving here, you don't need to worry about not fitting in necessarily. That is my opinion. That's my personal experience living in Portland my whole life. Now, I've also been a West Sider my whole life. I grew up in Southwest Portland, which is a little more insulated. It's a little more of a bubble around it. I live in Northwest Portland now. I still live on the West Side. It's a little more like boomer country over here. It's a little more laid back. The West Side overall, outside of downtown Portland, is a little more suburban. I wouldn't say more conservative necessarily, but maybe a little less passionate, a little less engaged in the political activism than you might get on the east side of the river in a lot of kind of the really real true Portland neighborhoods. And I've heard a lot of accounts from people who don't agree with me that their experience has not been that Portland is welcoming to people with ideas that are different from kind of status quo of the most politically engaged people here. And gosh, it probably just depends on exactly where you end up. It probably just depends on exactly who you're surrounded by, where you work, the type of circles you plug into here. You're going to find plenty of people who don't really care one way or another, about political stuff. So, I think, again, we still have this really loud but still minority, I think, of people who represent, again, some very passionate beliefs. And to what extent you feel that day to day, again, probably just depends on a number of different things. I was in Seattle recently, and my wife and I went to an oyster restaurant. We were talking to, the guy that was standing there. We were sitting at the bar, and he was shucking the oysters, and we were just kind of making small talk. And he told him we were from Portland, and he said that he worked in Portland for a few years, and he's like, I miss it in a lot of ways. It's beautiful. Love the restaurants. The food is great. But his account was more like, the people there that he was, kind of surrounded by and engaged with were like, if you speak out of line, if you don't kind of conform to, kind of the prevailing thoughts and theories as far as, again, speaking more towards some of the political stuff, that you were subject to potentially, maybe not necessarily being ostracized, but, you would be put in your place, if you weren't saying the right things. So I don't know. Again, that's really never been my experience. A lot of my time living in the city and in the areas where you have more kind of, true Portland. I'm like 10 years removed from that now too. And so maybe things have changed a little bit in the time where now, I live with my family in kind of a more suburban area now. So I don't know. It's tough to say, but Portland is a big place, the city itself, but also all the suburbs surrounding Portland. And I would say, especially if you live outside of Portland in more suburban areas, you're still going to see plenty of yard signs. You're still going to, I think, get some pretty strong opinions when it comes to political beliefs in particular, but it's going to be much less in your face and much more laid back. Okay, how about the weather? We talk about it a lot. I think if you've seen any video that we've made like this in the past, weather is a big topic, but it is one of those things where if you're coming from a different area, I think most people are saying, can I handle the weather? What should I expect? Is it really as bad as I feel, or hear that it is? And obviously it's going to be different for everybody. It's going to depend on where you're coming from. If you're coming from Phoenix, if you're coming from LA, if you're coming from places with year-round sunshine and warm weather, you will be in for a little bit of a shock. But I think a lot of people moving from those types of climates really enjoy the climate here, and even that can be part of what brings people to the area is experiencing 4 seasons. And you get all the greenery and the vegetation and the beautiful trees and all the outdoor space, and you have to kind of have the yin and the yang and take the good with the bad if you're going to get these beautiful warm months in the spring, late spring, obviously the summer, but really well into the fall, kind of through October. Really pleasant. I mean, as good as anywhere can be weather-wise, in that 5-6 month stretch throughout the year. Into the fall and the winter and early spring in particular, you're going to get a ton of precipitation, a ton of rain, not the most in the country. You're going to get a lot of gray and overcast days. You're going to get really mild weather, though. I think, a lot of people are coming from places or areas that have these extremes where you have these long, brutal winters with snow and ice and freezing temperatures for, weeks and weeks and months, or areas that have these like heat waves, where I think, was it Phoenix? Was it last year or maybe the year before? It was like 100 days in a row of over 100 degrees, or 90 days in a row of over 100 degrees. You're not going to get that here. You're going to get, again, a much more mild climate, but maybe a little bit of a less predictable climate. And my impression, again, as somebody who's lived in Portland my whole life, my impression of the weather changes year to year, because some years are really bad and some years are really great. Sometimes, you kind of get some crummy summers, where you have a little more rain and cloud and overcast in the summer. And then some years you get really mild winters. I think we're coming out of, or on pace for, rather, the warmest January on record in either in Oregon or in Portland, maybe both, I'm not sure, but it has been like 50 degrees and a ton of sunshine for the past several days. And again, I think it's really going to depend year to year. I think one thing to understand, maybe people are like this everywhere, but I think people in Portland are total babies, myself included, when it comes to the weather, because it's like you get to the summer, and it's like, God, I've been waiting all year, I've been waiting so long for the sunshine and the warm weather. And then, you start to get into the 90s a little bit, and it's like, oh, it's too hot. It's way too hot. I can't wait for it to cool down a little bit. I can't wait for fall. And then you get into, the fall, you get into some cooler weather, and it's like, it's too cold. It's too much rain. I can't wait for the summer. I can't wait for the warmer weather. And, this happens, just kind of goes on every year. It's like whatever season you're in a way, you're always kind of looking forward to the next. All right. How about buying a house in Portland and the Portland metro area? I mean, the market isn't exactly booming, and there's a ton we can talk about as far as market conditions, what the market has been like in recent years, what we might be looking at going into 2026, and everything, really by and large, forever has, as far as the real estate market, has been tied to interest rates. There's a lot of other, macro forces, like a pandemic, for example, that influence kind of, how the market's going to go, if people are going to be moving, if people are going to be staying put, things like that. But again, interest rates remain the ultimate driver, especially in recent years. If you look at 2021 and 2022, You had historic real estate appreciation, real estate price appreciation, where home prices went up 30, 40, 50%. So, more in some markets, and Portland was no exception to that. The market was absolutely ripping here, and, home values went up like crazy, and, every house that went on the market was getting 5, 10, 15 offers. Obviously that's not a sustainable market. And then, but that happened because interest rates came down to like 2 and 3%. So people were able to borrow money very, very cheaply. And then mid 2022, interest rates started to tick up a little bit. By 2023, they were up at 7%. They approached 8% a few times. They've been holding at 7% for, about 3 years until recently. In the past few weeks, they've come down to 6.25. Now they're right about 6%. So interest rates are trending downward, and that is definitely going to change the market. I mean, even if they stay where they are, we're going to see a lot more activity, a lot more competition, but probably a lot more people putting their house on the market too, because the people who have a 2% or 3% interest rate, they didn't want to sell their house and then go buy a house and get a 7% interest rate. But if you can get 5.75 or 5.5, you start to bridge that gap a little bit more, and it starts to become easier to justify. There's a lot of kind of pent up demand and pent up supply too. There's so many people who've been waiting, for interest rates to come down to buy. There's so many people who've been waiting for interest rates to come down to, put their house on the market so they can buy. So I think if we see things hold where they are, or especially if interest rates continue to trickle down, we're going to see a lot more activity than we have in the past couple of years. So if you are moving to Portland or anywhere, but I think Portland is a good example of kind of following the market trends nationally. I mean, the market has held pretty steady. We didn't swing too high. We didn't, pull back down too low. There was kind of a mini crash when interest rates went up super high so quickly, but we've since recovered that. So, again, Portland has really held pretty steady. It's a pretty healthy market as far as number of buyers and sellers and just overall the activity. And so I think considering where interest rates are right now, if we're looking at early 2026, if you are looking at buying anytime in the near future or into the spring, into the summer, I think you can expect a pretty active and pretty fast-paced market. All right, if you're moving to Portland, I mean, another thing to consider is business is not booming. And I think in particular, we're talking about the urban core, the urban center in downtown, where downtown Portland has been completely decimated by a number of factors. But I think what happened during COVID and homelessness and crime and rising rents and rising taxes and fewer people going into the city, this is all kind of culminated in today Portland having the highest commercial vacancy rate of any major city in the country. And you go downtown, you walk around. I mean, you go down any number of streets downtown, and it doesn't feel desolate. It doesn't feel like every other business is boarded up and shuttered. But, man, it does not feel bustling and booming. And obviously the data and the numbers support that. And I think the reasons for that is pretty clear cut with all the things that I just mentioned. Now, I'm mostly pretty optimistic by nature. I think I have to be optimistic. I obviously want to be honest to myself, when I'm thinking about, okay, how is Portland actually really doing? Of course, I want to be honest when I'm describing to somebody moving here from out of state how Portland is actually doing. And I think that it's hard to see things getting much worse than they are. I think we're seeing a lot more conversation, from the powers that be, the people making decisions around recognizing the issues and becoming more proactive in addressing these things. The crime, the homelessness, creating more incentives for businesses to come back into the city and creating more incentives for people to come back into the city as well. If you live in a city, if you live in a metro area that has a big city at its core, everybody shares in that space. And that's, that's such like a common denominator of the community, writ large, as far as, again, the city itself, obviously, but even the metro area. If you live way out in Hillsborough, or if you're in Happy Valley, or if you're up in Vancouver in Washington, or down in Woodburn, on the south side of the metro area, it's not like the big city is a world away. You might have to drive 45 minutes to get there, at least if it's rush hour or whatever. But, we all kind of have this place in common, and, kind of everything in terms of the conditions and the reputation. And ultimately, I think, there's some sense of pride in how the city is doing, or rather, if the city is doing well. I think most people want it to be doing well. But on the other end of that spectrum, if things aren't going well, I think, again, people even on the kind of the farthest reaches of the metro area really feel that. So there's kind of been this lingering desperation, I think, getting hit from the outside looking in with national media, all the things that have been said about Portland. I mean, Portland has been like this poster child for just like, everything that could be wrong with a city in the United States. And again, so much of the criticism is fair, and there are so many issues that, remain unsolved for sure. But I think, the ongoing kind of recognition of these problems, I think we've kind of hit this point where, people are going to be less and less patient with finding resolutions and finding solutions, for these issues. And it's, on one hand, I mean, things could obviously get worse, but it's hard to see things getting much worse than they have been. And even just anecdotally, I would say things have been improving steadily over the past couple of years. A lot of things have been Band-Aid solutions, in particular when it comes to like cleaning up the streets from tents. I mean, a lot of homeless encampments and things, kind of just get shuffled around, and, it doesn't really do anything to solve the issue. Whereas now, there's far more resources being poured into services, and it's being systemized both from the public and private side for actually creating opportunities to, eliminate the conditions that, create homelessness and a lot of the crime that is either, kind of tangentially or directly related to the homelessness issue that we have in Portland. So, just over this holiday season, there was some statistic, I don't exactly remember the numbers, but there was more people coming into the city, for the holiday events and festivals and the tree lighting and things like that, than there had been in like the last 5 to 10 years or something like that. I took my daughter to a class every Sunday for the past few weeks, right down on Broadway, right across from the Arlene Schnitzer Concert Hall. And there's like the Portland Symphony or some orchestra was doing, like holiday Christmas orchestral music, and that was going on like a few days a week or whatever. And I remember every Sunday dropping her off. There's, like lines of people around the corner, people out walking around, people coming in and out of restaurants and things like that. It just felt like, even in December, like when you're going to have a lower rate of foot traffic and the weather isn't as nice, it just felt like there was more people out and about, which, gosh, is so good to see. So I don't know. I don't think that, if you're looking at moving to Portland and thinking about the reputation and, what's true, what's not, what's going to affect you in your day-to-day life. I think one way or another, there are so many opportunities to be in a place, be in an area where, although even some of these problems, obviously still exist today, it's not going to affect you in your day-to-day life as far as, in particular, your safety or perceived feeling of safety even, which is, maybe just as important. All right, the last thing I'll talk about here, something we haven't talked about all that much, is more of the demographics of the city. And I think for a lot of people, kind of like I was speaking to initially in this video, it's like you're moving to an area and it's like, how am I going to fit in? What is it like culturally, really? Am I going to be amongst like-minded people? Am I going to have to change my lifestyle or change my political beliefs? And some of these things, some of these changes, you're going to kind of adapt to an area and where you are. But I think just purely from kind of an analysis point of view and perspective, I think looking at some of the demographics of the city, I don't know if it like completely paints the picture as in terms of like in terms of what it's like here. And I don't want anybody to take this information and, at least think I'm jumping to any kind of conclusions necessarily. It's like we'll talk about racial demographics and that breakdown. I mean, I think it's useful information to know. It's not like it's good because this or it's bad because that. But one of the most interesting things about Portland is Portland has the largest share of 35 to 49-year-olds of any city, of any major city, or rather any large city in the U.S. So the largest share of 35 to 39-year-olds. The median age in Portland is 38. So this is like, definitely millennial, elder millennial, kind of early Gen X town for sure. So take that however you want. But I think it does kind of illustrate that Portland isn't necessarily a place where like a ton of young people are moving to, say like after college, for example. This isn't like a place that is manufacturing what it means to be cool. This isn't a hub of culture. This is a place where, again, the largest percentage of 35 to 49-year-olds in the country, these are primarily, kind of middle-aged, professional class, families, young parents. That really makes up kind of the biggest contingent when you look at Portland, which is kind of interesting. And again, take that however you want. I'm not even necessarily going to jump to conclusions, but it is interesting to hear that information. And another thing too that's kind of interesting about Portland, and this is an area where like I think its reputation precedes it a little bit, is the racial diversity or maybe lack thereof does tell you a little bit about Portland and maybe what to expect a little bit. And I think speaking to more of the cultural aspects, not racial specifically, I mean, I think that in and of itself is unproductive, but speaking more just kind of toward the cultural aspects of things, I think is interesting to consider. And despite being a place that at least likes to consider itself as accepting, a place that celebrates diversity, the demographics here don't necessarily reflect that. And, that it doesn't have to be discouraging necessarily. Again, I do believe that Portland is a place that celebrates diversity and that is very accepting of, many different people in terms of, their culture. And, I think Portland would like to be more of a melting pot than it is. I mean, I can tell you that. And Portland or Oregon has a really ugly history when it comes to some of the racial stuff that, if you want to look into that, it's certainly interesting to know. But it's no coincidence that Portland is by a long shot the whitest city in the country. And interestingly, Seattle is second place, kind of a distant second place. Seattle is 59% white. Portland is 67% white. So again, by far the whitest city in the country. And if we break that down a little more, this is just census data. So Hispanic or Latino, 11.3%, Asian, 8.1%, African American, 5.8%, two or more races, 11.3%, American Indian or Alaskan Native, 0.8%, Native Hawaiian or Pacific Islander, 0.5%. So again, we're looking at a place that, should be welcoming to all people. And truly, again, I think is, but the demographics just don't necessarily reflect that. So again, I think though too, like looking at this again, purely from kind of a cultural lens, as opposed to just a racial lens, that that doesn't really do us any good. But from a cultural aspect, it tells you a little bit about what Portland really is ultimately. All right, always a little bit longer than I intended, but hopefully you found some nuggets of information there. Hopefully this gave you some perspective on some of the things to consider when you're moving to Portland. I mean, obviously there's a lot of great information online, so if you're moving to a new area, a new city, Google's your friend, no doubt. But I think kind of adding some texture and some context to, again, just what it's really going to be like living here is important, because as people who help facilitate, or rather as somebody who helps facilitate people's move to the area, I really kind of view myself as an ambassador for the area on one hand, but I would hate for somebody to move here and hate it ultimately. So I think just giving, as honest of a perspective as possible is important. And hopefully that's helpful for you. And if you are thinking about moving to Portland, and if you want to talk more about any of this stuff, or if you want to talk about your move, what buying a house is like, your budget, your timeline, give us a call, send us a text, shoot us an email, or click the link down below in the description of the video. Schedule a Zoom call with us and we can talk all about it. If this video was helpful, make sure to hit the like button. That helps us out a lot. If you want to get more videos like this, make sure to hit the subscribe button. Tap the little bell to get notified every time we drop a new video. As always, really appreciate you watching. Until next time, we'll talk to you later.